Hello everybody, welcome to the Wonky Angle, where I talk about electronic music, both new and old. And today, I'm talking about album number 3 from Amon Tobin, Permutation. Okay, now we're really getting into the stuff I imagine people would have been looking forward to the most when I first announced this series. Tobin's work before this point has all been well and good, enjoyable enough collections of standard breakbeat workouts and jazzy samples that, frankly, were not anything that revolutionary, even for the time they were released, if we're being honest. A follow you've heard from Amon Tobin is Adventures in Foam and Bricolage. It's likely you'll still enjoy them, but you might be wondering why this guy has the insanely high-regarded reputation that he does, since both records very much feel like a product of their time. And I really don't think you can credit Tobin for, inventing the idea of combining drum and bass with jazz sampling. No, the point at which Tobin's work really starts living up to the level of hype he often gets was his third album from 1998, just a year after his last record. Now, on the surface, Permutation sounds like more the exact same kind of stuff that he'd been doing before, still an almost entirely sample-based project built around breakbeats and old snippets of jazz records. The musical ingredients going into this album are the same musical ingredients that went into his last two. And yet there's something that immediately feels very different about this record in particular that you don't get out of the previous two. First of all, I may have just said that this album was built around breakbeats, though when I say that I only mean it by the literal definition of breakbeats, being looped and cut up samples of drumming. The traditional breakbeats that you think of when you hear that term, your Amen breaks and Apache breaks and all those, are barely present on this album at all. You get a couple of moments here and there, especially on the tracks Nightlife and Fast Eddie that use some of those classic breaks. But for the most part, Tobin's approach to the breaks he samples makes these drums sound a lot more organic. Cut out of flashy and complex solos that sounded impressive before editing them, and with a particular looseness to their performances, calling attention to the fact that they come more specifically from the jazz traditions than the electronic and hip-hop traditions you would have expected out of this kind of record at the time. Although still editing and looping them in a way where you're not about to forget that this is an electronic record at its core either. But the choice in jazz sampling outside of the drums also feels very different too. Not just cutting up dusty old loops from the 60s that sound like your typical hip-hop crate digging, but instead pulling from even older recordings from the swing era as well as movie soundtracks. The mixes he creates here are significantly more immersive and cinematic feeling. They're mixed to have a lot more bass presence and envelop you in whatever mood they might be trying to set up. This is one of those albums you can really lose yourself in, and the whole semi-experimental film noir vibes created by everything here was the kind of thing I was drawn to immediately, especially when I was first getting into his work when I was in college. That was around the time I was listening to stuff like Herbie Hancock's Death Wish soundtrack and Layla Schifrin's Bullet soundtrack all the time. This had become one of my most frequent go-to listens for when I wanted some of those moody and jazzy mystery movie vibes. Ryan Schreiber Pitchfork, when describing his 10 out of 10 feelings on Bricolage, may have talked about how listening to that album on a drive to Chicago put him in some kind of zen state where the music was becoming one with the city. And he also said something to a similar effect when he reviewed this as well. But Permutation is the album that actually made me feel the kinds of feelings he was describing. And also, unlike either Adventures in Foam or Bricolage, I don't think there's a single miss in the track listing on this thing. All 12 tracks on this album are great, and there's no redundancy either. Each track feels like it's bringing something unique to the table within its immersive urban atmosphere. Right out of the gate, the tone for the entire album is set by the opener Like Regular Chickens. You hit play and you're treated to a shuffling, jazzy drum break going over a foreboding, dark ambient pad. And that's before the spooky piano loops, vibraphones, and dramatic movie soundtrack string washes come in to fill out the mix and make it feel more dynamic, or the titular snippets of dialogue pulled out of David Lynch's Eraserhead, or the whole section around the middle where he starts editing in a lot more drum soloing and making the whole mix feel even more chaotic. Sure, on paper everything sounds the same as stuff he was doing on his last two albums, but there is some kind of invisible presence to this track that you'd be able to feel and notice immediately and not be able to describe. Something subtle that doesn't sound different on the surface but feels like there's some kind of intangible deeper dimension to it. A feeling of unnerving oppressiveness, a sense of dramatic stakes and tension that wasn't there before. Lets you know right away that this is going to be on a different level than anything those last two albums albums we're going to be able to prepare you for. But immediately after that, he takes a similar vibe into something with a very different energy level on the track Bridge, which is a track all about the drums. Lots of flashy, crushing drum solos being cut up and spliced together fairly seamlessly, and adding up to this marginally more irreverent feeling 5/4 groove, with some mysterious bass lines looping underneath. You get some occasional string washes and quiet horn licks and moody guitar lines swirling around on top, but those all very much feel secondary to the drums, which are trying to make the most propulsive and high-octane mix you could get out of this particular kind of vibe. Very immediately striking stuff, and it segues perfectly out of the opener. Though the intensity is cranked up to a fever pitch for the following track, Reanimator. This track doesn't sound like it's going to be that intense at first, with its initial samples of twinkling lullaby chimes and strings adding up to these odd, sour, and dissonant harmonies, really pushing more of that horror movie unnerving feeling. Though as the track progresses, you're hit with even more fluttering hyperspeed drumming, with more of a samba-influenced flavor going up next to some off-kilter upright bass riffs, until finally reaching all these aggressive patterns of squelching bass synths that have more power and force behind them than any other sound you've heard on the album up to that point, and some much heavier and denser breakbeats that really turn the track into this monstrous drum and bass epic. Once again, ideas that on paper sound like the kind of thing he was already doing before on the last two albums, but given significantly more weight and a feeling of dramatic importance that takes it to a different level. But as much as I love this opening stretch, the tracks from this album that always brought me in for the most repeat listens back in the day were unsurprisingly the ones that had more present melodic hooks. Those first three tracks are all excellent for their own reasons, but none of them precisely have the catchiest of melodies. They're much more about the chaotic mood setting, I guess. But then we get a track like Sordid, which primarily builds itself around the super haunting movie soundtrack string progressions that make way for more of a memorable lead melody than any of the melodies the album had been exploring previously. That alone drew me to come back and replay it on its own super frequently over the years, not to mention the way that it immediately brings in this heavy banging hip-hop beat that gives the track a lot more of a swaggering coolness. And while that movie soundtrack string hook doesn't stick around for that much of the track's full 7-minute running time, there's still plenty of other catchy progressions and buzzing and clanking synth riffs that get plenty of focus and are able to stick in my mind just as easily. And they bring the strings back in just the right places for all these pieces to feel like they naturally fit and coalesce together, culminating in the ending bit where every musical element introduced throughout the track, from the strings to the synth riffs to the hip-hop breaks to even denser samba drumming, all layer on top of each other in an aggressively climactic and chaotic heap. Awesome track. One of my easy go-to favorites. Although the track from this album that I put on the most frequently back in the day was, by some distance, the following track, Nightlife. This is one of the most easily accessible and melodic tracks in the bunch, although it's also put together in this, strange multi-part structure. The beginning and very ending of the track is based around these loops of nothing but very light and pleasant, but subtly unnerving pianos with some extremely light percussion in the background, super low-key but super striking and adding up to this oddly alluring dreamlike vibe, and the samples of flutes and choirs that come in to join really help advance that effect. But less than a minute in, the entire mix stops dead for some odd movie strings and synth effects as all the other elements scatter out of the mix and leave this even more unnerving empty negative space. And then the track progresses into its next section, which forms completely different hooks out of a lot of the same elements. First focusing on these mysterious pizzicato strings, building on a bunch of classic amen breaks on top to turn the track into more of a standard old school jungle mix, but also bringing in these other flute progressions as a sort of primary chorus section for the whole track, as well as these snazzy old school dramatic orchestral hits at the end of every couple of bars. Every single musical element feels like they could have come from a different track, and yet they all fit together so naturally as if this was the way they were always meant to be presented. And all the various hooks the track cycles through can all lodge themselves in my head and stay there for extended periods of time. I have had plenty of listens of this track over the years where its effect wasn't quite as potent, just thanks to pure personal overexposure, but this is definitely in the running for my personal favorite individual track Amon Tobin ever released. It's certainly the one I've listened to the most times by quantity, for better or worse, I suppose. Anyway, moving on from there, next track is Escape. This one moves back away from the melodies and towards some much darker and bassier IDM mixes, lots of layers of buzzing synths drilling and tunneling through each other, with lots of glitches and fuzzy effects and the occasional squeaking trumpet. Although this track is most made memorable by its samples from some old 1940s radio drama detailing what sounds like, well, a prison escape, as two guys plan to tunnel under a wall, and one of the guys has a super thick, cartoonish New York gangster accent. The Doit? What are we gonna do with the Doit? I wouldn't put this track among the biggest highlights in the bunch, but I can certainly easily remember it, and it probably would have been a bigger highlight on a different album that wasn't already as packed with highlights as it is. Though it also segues quite nicely into the following track, Switch. Now, Switch is a track that, if you listen to it out of context, you might get jump-scared by the horrible screeching noise that immediately starts the track off. Although this noise does make for a natural payoff to all the weird noises the previous track was exploring and leading up to, so it's not quite as harsh a start when you listen to the album in full. Although the main reason I remember this track as well as I do is not the opening 3 seconds, but rather the classy and playful piano loops the track quickly slips in, which rapidly overtake the track and turn it into another one of the most easily approachable moments on the album. Got some melancholic woodwinds in the mix for a bit of atmosphere, but the track is mostly just one playful and upbeat jazzy piano loop that sticks in the head really easily once again. Kind of a spiritual companion to what he did on Stony Street on his previous album. It's also easily the shortest track in the bunch at a little under 4 minutes, borders on almost feeling like an interlude in greater context, but it's still another moment that leaves a very strong impression, and I've come back to quite frequently. I can definitely mark that as a highlight as well. Next up we got People Like Frank, another track that I technically wouldn't put among my favorites here, but still would have been a major highlight on a less consistent album. And I suspect will also be a much bigger favorite for plenty of other people, considering both the lead bass line and string washes looping throughout the track are pulled directly from Angelo Badalamenti's soundtrack to David Lynch's Blue Velvet. Also, it brings in a bunch of the same kinds of chaotic drumming and heavy synth riffs as what showed up on an earlier track on this album, such as Reanimator. It's definitely one of those tracks you can tell was meant as something of a crucial centerpiece-ish moment for the album as a whole. I am admittedly not up on my David Lynch enough for this to have left the most immediate of impressions. To me, it sounded like another solid iteration of other ideas the album did elsewhere, but still really nice stuff regardless. There's also Sultan Drops, another track that tends not to stand out as much to me in greater album context, but is certainly more interesting when I listen to it out of context. As you'd guess from the title, this one's kind of going for a Middle Eastern-inspired vibe. I quite like that initial mix that brings in a bunch of mysterious flutes, some heavy organic percussion, and some synth strings that remind me of certain moments from the Future Sound of London's Lifeforms. Though as the track goes on, it progressively gets almost entirely overtaken by all the much more chaotic jazz drumming that gets much noisier and buries a lot of the other elements in the mix. By the middle, all of those initial elements aren't even audible at all anymore and being replaced by some horn sections vaguely resembling distant car horns honking. But once again, all of it comes back together quite climactically at the end. Not the most coherent of tracks on this album. I guess if you put a gun to my head and told me to pick a least favorite here, I guess I would go with that track, although once again I would still take it over most of the stuff on Bricolage. It is a very intriguing mix of ideas all the same, and I do think it helps add some extra flavor to the experience that other tracks here don't. But alright, everything past this point I don't really have much to complain or nitpick about. That takes us into the last quarter, which is all highlights. Fast Eddie is the album's longest track and possibly its most tension-inducing, which should be saying something. Certainly it's the track that, as you might guess from the title, feels like it's immediately starting off the most fast-paced. Just got all these simple piano and string loops that, while very quiet and low-key, feel very unstable and rickety. I guess evoking the feeling of, racing on a ledge that is overlooking a huge drop, like you're in danger of falling a massive height guaranteed to kill you when you hit the ground. The mix of loops may once again be very simple and sparse, but get something innately catchy out of these disparate elements. And that's, of course, before all the classic amen breaks and stuff come back in to kick the track into that drum and bass high gear, and we have sidetracks into oily synth bass too. It may not be the most immediately hard-hitting track in the bunch, but it might be the one that most effectively gets the adrenaline going, so that's another big favorite, one that's grown on me more recently too. I don't know if it used to be as big a highlight for me when I was in college, but it is now. Next we slow things down a touch for penultimate track Toys. which is mostly built out of thumping hip-hop beats, samples of triangles, and off-kilter bass lines. There's some more comforting moments in this track with some warmer string pads and pianos, but also some actively weirder moments with these strange and childish percussive orchestral passages that have a bunch of xylophones in them, as well as some, thicker stomping synth bass. I guess those parts are evoking the imagery of marching toy soldiers or something. One of those tracks that has a lot of different elements that you wouldn't necessarily think would go together, but gets it to make sense in some way, and the weirder off-kilterness becomes part of the charm. And finally, that transitions quite effectively into the closer, Nova. After an album full of these crazy twists and turns and heavy octane bangers and mystery movie and horror movie themes, this feels like a nice, comfortable exhale and resolution to the entire story this album took you through, and in direct contrast to everything else on the album, there's absolutely no tension at all here. It's just this really nice and pleasant, relaxed bossa nova cut. Super comfy guitar loops going up next to saxophone licks and cascading vibraphones. This track showing up at the end makes it feel like everyone who was in danger has been saved and is gonna turn out just fine. All the imminent threats have been taken care of. Nobody got seriously injured. The lead romantic couple gets engaged or some shit. It's just the most unambiguously happy ending an album like this could possibly have. And there's some real nice catharsis too, going through this whole journey and coming out at the end on a note this uplifting. Perfect way to close this whole thing out. At least on the CD and digital versions of this album. I should probably mention that the vinyl version completely shuffles the sequencing around ad nauseum. I guess I'm not against Sordid as an opener on the vinyl version, but I do feel like the alternate LP sequencing kind of scrambles what would have otherwise been more of a coherent emotional arc in the track listing I'm used to. Choices like Fast Eddie and Nova being put in the middle first half, or Escape right before Nightlife, I just can't get that to make sense in my mind. That would feel very wrong to me. I guess if there's any benefit to that version, it's the addition of one more track at the end called Melody Infringement, which is a good track that features a bit of all too well-aged social commentary expressed through its sampling of what sounds like a copyright lawyer being a pain in the ass about the similarities between two tracks' melodies. Hence the title. Also kind of has that, old school 40s swing feel to it, the instrumental loops. I guess it could serviceably work as an ending, but it's obviously not preferable to finishing with Nova. But yeah, that's finally everything to discuss on Permutation. Y'all probably didn't need me to tell you if this is a classic and an all-timer, you probably already knew that. This album's already considered one of the all-time greats and one of the most effective combinations of electronic and jazz stylings ever made. I obviously completely agree with the reputation it's already cemented for itself. I put it on my favorites of all time list back in 2016, and I still think it holds up as a classic now. That something like this came out in the late 90s probably won't be, catching anyone off guard. It does sound like something that would have come out around 1998, but at the same time, it is nowhere near as much of a product of its time as the two albums that led up to it. Tobin had found a way to put these loops together that didn't sound quite like anyone else at the time, and even people who've tried to come around and follow his lead since haven't quite been able to hit upon what he did here. Lots of people can make albums that sound like bricolage, but there is only one Permutation. I guess there's also his next album, which does hit a lot of similar notes as this one too, but minor spoilers, even that one I do not personally hold up on Permutation's level. This was clearly the point at which Amon Tobin went from merely being a decently promising jazz breaks producer into the legend who transcended the scene he came up in that we know him to be today. I still think this holds up as a must-listen over 25 years later, and of course I am overall feeling a solid 9 out of 10 on it. But of course, this is just my opinion. You can feel free to disagree with it, but I'd like to hear your thoughts, so leave the comments in the comment thing down there. Shout out to my Patreon supporters. They're awesome people. You want to add yourself to that list? Link to my Patreon is in the description. But yeah, that's pretty much it. That's all for today. See you next time.